Salutations and also greetings. Welcome to League on Lock. My name is Eric, and it's time for the tumultuous power rankings from NA and EU. No LCK this week because it's the same as last week. They didn't play, they had their break. They do get back into action later on this week, which means they're kind of on the same timeline as the LCS with the LEC. Still a week ahead, but today we're starting with North America, your LCS Week 3 power rankings, and there's going to be some similarities to what you saw last week, and a couple of teams went in very opposite directions on the leaderboard this week. Obviously, Liquid is still going to be number one, and really we should be putting a different tier for them because it's not close, any of the other teams behind them, but Cloud9 moves up one spot into that second place. They faltered a bit last week against CLG, but here in week 3, they looked pretty solid, a 2-0 week for them, and I think right now they're definitely going to be, they are the second best team in North America. FlyQuest still in the top 3, which might be a little bit surprising to some people considering they had an 0-2 week, but really they had 2 solid weeks, 1 bad week, which means they're still kind of in that top 3, especially when there's a mishmash behind them of 3-3 and 2-4 teams. It's really hard to differentiate between all of those other squads. 100 Thieves, biggest climb of the week by far. 5 spots into that top 4. They looked like a completely different squad in week 3, and we knew that they would rebound from their 1-3 start. This team just had way too much talent on it to be sitting at the bottom of the barrel in North America. Someday is returning to glory, and their first win against Golden Guardians was him turning around a 3v5 stealing Baron after the Thieves had initially thrown the game. But this week, plenty of other players stepped up for 100 Thieves, who he already starting his rebound. He got a lot of criticism from the first couple of weeks with his bad TPs, some fail flashes, but he had a game-winning flank here, and even in the second game that they played, he was rock solid on the rise, and Bang wasn't on the Ezreal. Wasn't on the Victor, excuse me. He was on the Ezreal and able to carry some of these team fights for them. And as the meta shifts towards crit-focused AD carries, you only expect 100 Thieves to get even better and Bang's performance to continue to grow. And we'll be talking about him as the top 2 AD carries in NA, I think, towards the end of the regular season and even the next couple of weeks. You'll be saying that. 100 Thieves, I think 100 Thieves, Cloud9, and Liquid obviously are going to be the clear top 3 teams going forward. Rounding out the top 5 on our power rankings, you have CLG, who, I mean, with all the movement around them, they just kind of stay in the same spot. They went 1-1. They broke the 0-2 or 2-0 streak. They were looking decent, I would say, and they didn't really do enough to move up into that top 4 and didn't do enough to lose when some of these other teams were very disappointing this week. Echo Fox went 1-1. Rush avoids going 0-2 yet again. They move up a couple of spots into that top 6, which is surprising to have them kind of on that playoff bubble right now. I thought this team would for sure be last place, be the 10th place squad, but Rush has looked really, I thought he'd be the showstopper on this team. He hasn't necessarily been yet. Phoenix has actually looked good. Solo is very consistent in the top lane and kind of underrated in that regard. And the bottom lane of Apollo and Hakuo look more like spring split clutch than they did in the summer with them. Number 7, we had Optic Gaming there. It's the starting roster that we projected with Meteos, Arrow, and Big back in there. I actually think they looked better still after seeing them in week 3. They looked better with that Academy roster. Even Arrow has looked questionable in the couple of games that he's played. So I'd like to see Dardoch back on that starting roster. Dokla has been fine, but bring back Dardoch, and really Gate looked better as well. Even Asta, I might give him more looks even over Arrow, the former MVP in North America. TSM tied with Clutch for the biggest falls of the week, and obviously an 0-2 week for TSM will have them doing just that. There's a lot of question marks with this squad, and some of the issues that they had in 2018 are arising yet again here in 2019 with the communication issues not exactly being on the same page. Now it's a very new roster, 3 new players, so obviously there's going to be a lot of synergy and in-game leadership communication that they have to figure out. But when it comes to a lot of these team fights, you saw even in week 2, Sven jumping in on the Kai'Sa when everyone else was jumping out, and here he's getting caught out. I feel like TSM as a whole, when it comes to team fights, you hear the communication, they kind of call out target priority, but outside of that, they just are not on the same page. Rarely do you see people actually peeling for Sven until it's too late in a lot of these fights. He's kind of left on his own, which is your solo queue nightmare as an AD carry, and what happens in most games, because that's how solo queue works. But aside from target priority, kind of chaining their CC and just when to take fights is definitely off for TSM, and they should have beaten Golden Guardians. They had a big lead early on, a couple of throne fights, that one in the jungle that you saw, and they were in it against Cloud9 in the early game. So where the early game was their issue in 2018, where they just did nothing and lost and waited till late game, actually they're pretty aggressive in the early game here in 2019, trying to make plenty of plays, and sometimes it just doesn't work out, or it does, and it nets them a pretty sizable early game lead. But when it comes to these skirmishes and late game fights, TSM are just not on the same page. They're down at 2-4, which really is tied for dead last. And you might be saying, why is TSM higher than the Guardians on the power rankings when GGS just beat them in the head-to-head? But we can't forget the first 2 weeks that the Guardians put up. We did have them go up 1 spot, but I just can't put them more than that because of how bad they were in the first 4 games. I expect them to be closer to what we saw in week 3 than the first couple of weeks, but we need to see more before we can actually get them out of that bottom 2. And Clutch, on the other hand, it looks more like week 1 was the anomaly for them, because they've lost 4 in a row now after that 2-0 start. They've climbed down in both of the last weeks, and now they hit the rock bottom, which is 10th place here behind the Guardians. And Clutch, I mean, Huni has looked highly questionable even on some of these niche picks that they've had. Lyra, you thought that synergy between the top side of the map would actually be one of the strengths for Clutch, but that has not been the case. Piglet has really been the best performer on this squad, but as a whole, Clutch is still looking like one of the weaker teams so far, and they're coming in at 10 because the Guardians went 2-0, and TSM, they probably played well enough to not go 0-2 last week, but in the key moments and the key, again, late game, mid-game fights, they couldn't get it done. They lost those games, so they're 0-2. They're in at number 8, but TSM should still be a playoff team with this roster. There's so much individual talent on it, but right now 2-4, just like 2018, they got a hole to climb themselves out of.